Now, travel disruption on the cards are not across Europe. A strike action by Ryanair staff may escalate. The airline's Italian crews have announced they'll hold a 24-hour work stoppage on June the 25th in a dispute over pay. Action's already been announced for this month and next by cabin crew in Spain and Portugal, while Ryanair's French crew down tools last Sunday and Monday, leading to flight cancellations. Editor of Air and Travel magazine is Eoghan Corry, who's on the line. Hi, Eoghan.
Good morning.
Good morning. This came across all of a sudden. The last I saw was Ryanair saying they'd done a deal with 90% of their crews, and they were just maybe just going to sort it out with the Spanish, and now it looks like Europe-wide.
Yeah, it's absolutely true that they have signed deals. If listeners will remember, back in 2017, Ryanair very suddenly announced that they would recognise trade unions. They started this fervent negotiations, and in about 6 to 9 months, they had signed deals with the largest pilot union and the largest cabin crew union. But everywhere you sign a deal with a union, particularly if there's a sort of a complex trade union structure, and aviation is very heavily unionised. It's one of the few areas in the private sector that remains very heavily unionised. You're going to have the unions that didn't sign the deal. That's in a line, that's what's happening. For instance, in Spain, they signed a big agreement with Comisiones Obreras, the biggest cabin crew union, the CCOO, in May, and then the USO and syndicate CPLA. They both said that Lydia Arasans and Monique Duthier, very forceful trade unionists, both said that CCO had betrayed the movement. There was also an issue that some of their members were now joining CCO, so they've called a strike. Italy, pretty similar, a deal with the FIT-CISL, ANPAC and ANPAV all signed, and then FIT-CGIL, which is not to be confused with FIT-CISL. They are the ones that are saying they're going on strike. In Portugal, STT-AMP, huge union, signed the deal. SMT, VAC, they only have about 3% of the support. They are calling the strike. So what we're seeing is everywhere there's a deal, there's going to be, trade unions, they're competing for members, all of that stuff, saying, oh, this is not good enough. And where that creates a problem is that they can't go back in and get the same deal to justify to their members. They need something a bit more. So it's like the Irish trade union movement in the old days, when there was a lot of belligerence between unions before the sort of agreements that were reached around 1987. And I don't see any way that Ryanair will operate in the 36 countries that they do with 82 bases without running into all of this trade union. Every time there's an agreement, there's a disagreement. The interesting thing is whether this big strike by 6 of their trade unions, none of them are the biggest, some of them are very small, but they're operating across borders because Ryanair operates across borders. And the history of trade unionism in Europe will be, historians will be looking at this development in years to come, because remember, the trade unions only have to make one big dent on Ryanair services to have won. They will just keep coming back and trying until they achieve it. Ryanair is saying we've flown through dozens of these strikes. The one in France at the weekend that you referenced stopped 20 flights. They ferried all those passengers with another and put them on another flight almost immediately. So they are saying they're going to be able to fly through this.
Right, so it's between unions. Before we get into the consequences of it, it's rivalry between unions that is the situation here, with the members saying, well, maybe this group will get us a better deal than that group. Is that the way it's working?
Partly because it's more trade unions are always complicated. The Spanish situation is very interesting. The union that Ryanair did the deal with is supposed to be the biggest. The second biggest is claiming we're bigger than them. Italy is one of the most unionized countries in Europe. So it will be interesting if that gets the actual support. About 34% of Italian workers are members of trade union. It's about 25% in Ireland by rate of comparison, and 12% in Spain. But what the Italian unions are seeking is support from trade unionists in general, not to fly Ryanair. What the Spanish are seeking is also that they have Pedro Sanchez, obviously a socialist prime minister. Some listeners will remember him as a child learning his English as one of those Spanish students in Ireland. But he is, they're hoping he'll come into the debate and put some regulations in place that will sort of calm Ryanair down. Trade union disputes are always about how much damage I can inflict on your product and how much power will rest in the trade. And the background of aviation trade unions is that there was one airline per country. It was Iberia, it was Alitalia, Air France, Lufthansa, Aer Lingus, British Airways, 5 or 6 unions in that. They had a great deal of power because almost everybody who worked for the airline was in one of those trade unions. Low-cost aviation changed all that, and unions have really had to rethink their strategy, and that's partly what's going on here. The Italian strike is directed at EasyJet as well as Ryanair.
So what are they essentially looking for?
It all comes back to the same 3 or 4 things. One of the big things that they're chasing Ryanair on is local regulation. Ryanair is an Irish company. It's regulated by Irish law. It's also subject to EU law. But they want Spanish local law. The French want French local law. The Italians want Italian local law. The Slovakians want the Slovakian local law to apply to Ryanair. Now, Ryanair said they'll be subject to the Irish and ultimately the European regulations on that. They generally look for some of Ryanair's more their hardline practices about shifts and all of those. They want improvements in them. That's the agreement that the CCAO got in Spain, where it's rostered 5 days on, 3 days off for cabin crew. They got €1,000 wage increase. So they're standard bread and butter trade union things that are looked for at all times. Some incendiary claims being made. Where some of the unions are claiming that crew are flying exhausted, and that they're being denied access to water where they're on board. They're the sort of things that Ryanair deny, and in fact they walked out of one of the meetings when one of those claims was made.
Okay, now, how does it affect the passengers and those particular dates and people, making plans for the holidays, holidays after all these years of not being able to go on them? What do you think the effect will be?
0. The reality is that we went through dozens of strikes in the summer of 2018 and 2019. Ryanair flew through them all. The maximum cancellations we've had is 20 flights, and you've got to remember that Ryanair put 2,400 flights in the air every day. You've got alternatives. It's not like if some listeners will remember Aer Lingus 1977 when the strike lasted 6 months and it caused devastation. It actually impacted GDP. It stopped trade coming on off the island, holidays, everything. That sort of impact is long gone because Ryanair has so many alternatives to move their passengers around. So if somebody impacts a flight from the Alghero route out of Dublin or something like that, or Milan, Lapenza, or Bergamo, or one of those Ryanair flights, they have an alternative very quickly. And you also, aviation does this all the time. An ice storm can close down, can cause more disruption. A single ice storm would cause more disruption than all the strikes that Ryanair has flown through so far put together.
Okay, we used to hear about the air traffic controllers all the time. That was the thing.
They're still there, by the way. They have not gone away.
Well, I'm glad they're not gone away, but they're still as angry as they used to be.
Absolutely. The Marseille air traffic controllers caused enormous delays. Obviously, they didn't cancel that many flights, but they are belligerent as well, and that isn't just a Ryanair issue. That's everybody's issue. They have. We've had 2 hotbeds of trade union activity among the air traffic controllers, and there again you have 3 competing unions. Paris tends to be less affected than the south of France. I think Marseille is the one that can do an awful lot of damage. There's all sorts of complaints by the airlines that neighbouring countries should be given overfly rights by the Europe that with the technologies in place, for instance, that Belgian air traffic controllers should allow overflights of France. But when the French go on strike, all flights over France are shut down, and that causes havoc for people going from Ireland to Italy, for example. That they're still there. You know, as I say, aviation has a very a history of being very strongly unionised, and it's one of the few areas of the private sector, because it comes from the public sector originally. Public sector it tends to be more unionised than private sector across Europe.
Right, and they have grievances, I suppose, that need to be resolved. But listen, we didn't talk about delays at the airport. What's going on? Are people sailing through? Sailing
through some of the time. It can get messy. We had Terminal 1 is where most of the problems have been. Terminal 2 had an hour queue Monday morning, unexpectedly. Because numbers are stretched, things can go wrong very quickly when they do. The numbers game, though, is important here. There are 30 new security staff being put in place. By the end of this month, there will be 780 extra security staff from the downturn during COVID, and they're recruiting another extra 100 on top of that for July. They should be staffed up in security, but the management measures are still in place. Terminal 1, for instance, you're not being dropped off if you're dropping off someone, you're not going to drop them off on the ramp. That ramp road is closed. You're driven round as if you were going into the car park where the coaches are picking up, and then everyone goes through that car park portal building into the one door, and that creates a little bit of pressure because it's down to one door. Then it's turn left if you've no bag. Most people going through Terminal 1 are checking with Ryanair, and Ryanair is at the end of the hall to the right. That seems to be working. The triage system has been tested, hasn't actually been implemented yet, but they have it ready to go should pressure come, and pressure is not going to go away. It's going to be 50,000 departing, 50,000 arriving for a lot of days this summer. We're really back to where we were in 2019, except with fewer staff and all the services really stretched. That includes the baggage hall as well, by the way.
Yeah, I've heard about the baggage difficulties. Though I've heard from people who've gone through in about 20 minutes and things like that. Are there particular times of the day where, 20 minutes, half an hour is the expected time? What's it like, say, people heading out on Friday afternoon, Friday evening for a weekend somewhere?
Well, 10 minutes. People have
10 minutes?
Flown, have absolutely flown through. At the moment, it's 10 minutes in Terminal 1. But the norm is 30 minutes, and that's what it is at the moment in Terminal 2. And it can be an hour, as I say. Okay. To put this in perspective, if it was 30 minutes in 2019, there'd been an investigation in Dublin Airport. How did the security queue get to 30 minutes? So that is the norm now, and it goes up to an hour. The car park is also an issue, and it's booked out for certain dates in July and August. And the Dublin Airport is telling people find some other way getting to the airport, because it's not the Dublin Airport car parks are all operating like they did in 2019. But Quick Park, which some listeners will be familiar with, 6,500 spaces. It's not coming back for the summer. I think NAM are involved. It's probably coming onto the market at the end of the year. But it's 6,500 spaces out of the system at a time when you
expect delays. Okay, Eoghan Corry, editor of Air and Travel magazine.
Always a great pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Eoghan, for all that information. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, morning show, East Coast.